For millennia, the world has sought the sacred mountain, a place of fire, glory, and mystery. Where is Mount Sinai really located? Ancient traditions and new evidence challenge what we thought we knew. Archaeologists and explorers follow the traces of an enigma that has remained buried for centuries. This truth will be revealed to you today.
Shalom, shalom. Welcome to our channel, La Mishnah TV. Thank you so much for joining us once again. Today, within the context of the weekly Torah portions, Behar and Bechukotai, we are going to take a journey in a time machine to attempt to uncover one of the most enigmatic and often overlooked mysteries in all of the Holy Scriptures. Where is Mount Sinai located? For over 3,000 years, a mountain lost in the desert has divided rabbis, archaeologists, historians, biblical explorers, and even governments. It is a mountain that, according to tradition, served as the setting for the most momentous event in the spiritual history of the West, the giving of the Torah to Moses. Yet, there is a monumental problem. No one can prove with certainty where Mount Sinai actually stood. And this question is no minor geographical detail, for if Sinai can be historically identified, then the Exodus ceases to be merely a theological narrative and enters the realm of verifiable history. But if it cannot be located, then we are facing one of the greatest enigmas of ancient civilization. For centuries, Christian tradition identified Mount Sinai, and by this I mean the specific mountain that is the subject of our investigation, with the Mount Sinai located on the Egyptian peninsula, south of the modern state of Israel. It was there that the famous Monastery of St. Catherine, one of the oldest monastic centers in the world, was built. However, this identification emerged quite late, centuries after the time of Moses. It does not stem directly from the biblical text itself. And so, an uncomfortable question arises. Why does the biblical text itself seem to point toward Arabia? The New Testament contains an explosive statement. In his epistle to the Galatians, Paul of Tarsus writes, "For Sinai is in Arabia." A brief assertion, yet one that is devastating to traditional interpretations. And this should open your mind to a new line of inquiry. Why did Paul not know where Mount Sinai was located? Arabia? Which Arabia was Paul referring to in the first century? To modern-day Saudi Arabia? To Nabatean territory? To the eastern region of the Gulf of Aqaba? Or to something else entirely? And here begins the true mystery. This is Abel Flores, journalist and founder of La Mishnah TV, speaking to you. Before we begin, I ask that you please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Give us a like, and don't forget to visit us at our website, lamishna.com, where you will find additional material, articles, and reports on all these topics and more, including our free course covering the entire Mishnah in both Spanish and English, starting from the very first tractate, Barakot. Don't go anywhere.
When one examines ancient sources, the Torah, the Talmud, the Midrash, Greco-Roman historians, classical geographers, and Arab chroniclers, one discovers that the descriptions do not fit perfectly with the traditional geography accepted for centuries. Some researchers contend that the true Sinai lies within Saudi territory, specifically in an area known in Arabic as Jabal al-Laus. Others believe this theory is archaeologically untenable, driven more by modern apologetic agendas than by actual scientific evidence. Yet, the traditional location in Egypt is not without its own problems. There is no archaeological consensus, there is no definitive inscription, there is no conclusive evidence stating, "Here stood Israel before the mountain." Nevertheless, clues do exist. Traces, ambiguous texts, ancient place names, caravan routes, Egyptian references, archaeological silences, and geographical anomalies that have fueled one of the most complex investigations in the biblical world. This documentary will not merely rehash popular narratives or religious tourism. We will venture into the terrain where Semitic philology, Levantine archaeology, the geopolitics of the ancient world, and biblical textual criticism all converge. We will analyze what the ancient Jewish sources truly say, what the sages understood regarding Sinai, what Arabia signified in Roman times, which mountains today vie for the title of the true biblical Horeb, and which modern pieces of evidence support or dismantle each respective theory. For perhaps the greatest mystery is not simply where Mount Sinai was located, but rather why, after millennia of religious tradition, the exact spot where, according to the biblical account, God spoke to Moses remains one of the most hotly contested secrets in human history. There is a fascinating detail that almost no one mentions when speaking of Mount Sinai. The Bible never provides an exact coordinate, and that changes the entire discussion. Ancient sources do not present a single verifiable Sinai. Instead, they present a map of echoes, a geographical field of clues. Horeb, Midian, Paran, Seir, Arabia, Amalekite territories, regions connected by transit routes linking Egypt, the Negev, Edom, and northwestern Arabia. And here lies the great historical irony. Later tradition eventually fixed the location of Sinai in the southern part of the Egyptian peninsula, specifically around the modern-day Monastery of St. Catherine. Yet the most ancient texts are far more ambiguous and complex. In Hebrew, Horeb derives from a root associated with dryness and desolation. It does not merely describe a mountain, it describes a spiritual experience amidst the void. Jewish sources, including Midrashim and various commentators, link Sinai to Midian, the place where Moses encountered the burning bush. Other biblical texts associated with Arabia. Even Flavius Josephus and certain Greco-Roman authors suggest locations distinct from those of the classical tradition. The academic and critical conclusion is unequivocal. Sinai cannot be identified based on a single isolated citation. Its location must be reconstructed through ancient routes, place names, archaeology, and layers of overlapping traditions. For sometimes, the question is not merely where Sinai was located, but why the text chose to leave it partially concealed. There is a problem that troubles both believers and scholars alike. The Torah never locates Mount Sinai with cartographic precision, and the more one studies the text, the more evident this ambiguity becomes. The primary source is the Torah itself. Two fundamental names appear therein, Sinai and Horeb. At times, they seem distinct. At other times, they appear to be the same place viewed through the lens of different traditions. In Exodus 19, Israel arrives at the wilderness of Sinai in the 3rd month after departing from Egypt. The people encamp opposite the mountain, and there the most momentous revelation in all of biblical history takes place. Yet the text offers no coordinates. What it does offer is a narrative sequence: Egypt, the sea, the wilderness, Rephidim, and finally Sinai. And here the first crucial detail emerges. Sinai does not initially appear as an isolated mountain, but rather as part of a larger region, the wilderness of Sinai. In other words, the text presupposes that its original audience was familiar with this landscape. The problem is that we no longer share that ancient mental map. Later, in Deuteronomy, the mountain frequently goes by another name, Horeb. And Deuteronomy 1:2 introduces a phrase that proves explosive for researchers. It states that there are 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. It appears to be a simple geographical note, but it is not, for it links Horeb to routes leading towards Seir, Edom, and Kadesh Barnea, that is to say, towards southern Canaan and the Negev. It does not necessarily describe a mountain lost in the southernmost reaches of the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, as later tradition would come to assert. In other words, the Torah itself complicates the geography more than it resolves it. The mountain appears simultaneously as a site of divine revelation, a specific location within the wilderness, a place associated with Horeb, and a place connected to Midian, Paran, and Seir, as well as a territory situated outside of Egypt, though not necessarily within the traditional peninsula we today call Sinai. And here emerges a deeply biblical idea. Revelation occurs in a borderland space. Not at the center of the empire, not in monumental cities, but in a liminal zone, uncertain, almost impossible to pin down. perhaps because the message was more important than the map. There is a clue in the biblical narrative that proves deeply unsettling for the traditional location of Sinai, and it appears long before the giving of the Torah. Exodus 3 tells us that Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, the priest of Midian, when he arrived at the mountain of God, Horeb. It seems like a minor detail until one grasps its geographical implications, for the text directly links Horeb to the Midianite world. And here begins one of the most intense debates in modern biblical scholarship. Was Horeb located within Midian, near Midian, or simply in a desert region traversed by Midianite tribes? The difference seems slight, yet it completely redraws the map. The maximalist interpretation maintains that Horeb, and by extension Sinai, was indeed situated within Midianite territory. This shifts the search toward northwestern Arabia, possibly on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba. This theory gained traction because biblical sources repeatedly associate Midian with that specific Arabian region. Furthermore, there is a fascinating psychological element. Moses flees Egypt and integrates himself precisely into Midian. His first prophetic experience takes place there. The burning bush does not appear on Egyptian soil, but rather within the realm of exile, of the periphery, of the eastern desert. A more cautious reading, however, introduces an important nuance. The text does not explicitly state that Horeb lay within Midian. It merely asserts that Moses, while living among the Midianites, led his flocks into a vast desert region. In the ancient nomadic world, pastoral routes could span enormous distances, and herein lies the true historical conundrum. The first narrative appearance of the Mountain of God is linked to Midian, not to the monastic south of the Sinai Peninsula, where, centuries later, the Byzantine Christian tradition would fix the site of the sacred mountain. This means that the original geography of the narrative was likely far more eastern and far more complex than we imagine today. And perhaps that is the great lesson of the text. Before becoming a religious symbol, Sinai was a frontier, movement, exile, and passage. For in the Bible, revelation rarely occurs in comfortable places. It takes place in uncertain territories, where human beings can no longer rely on maps, but solely on inner direction. There exists a poetic thread within the Bible that many readers overlook, yet one that may preserve one of the most ancient geographical memories regarding Sinai. It does not appear on maps, it appears in hymns, and ancient hymns, curiously enough, often preserve traditions far more archaic than the narratives that follow them. Deuteronomy 33:2 declares that Hashem came from Sinai, shone forth from Seir, and appeared from Mount Paran. Later, Judges 5:4 and 5 describes Yahweh marching out from Seir and advancing from the fields of Edom. And Habakkuk 3:3 adds another decisive piece to the puzzle. God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Observe the pattern: Sinai, Seir, Edom, Paran, Teman. These are not random names, they form an extremely coherent geographical and theological axis. Seir and Edom are associated with southern Transjordan. Teman is traditionally linked to Edom or neighboring Arabian regions. Paran appears associated with the southern wilderness and the roots of the Negev, and this entire ensemble points toward the southern and southeastern arc of Canaan, not toward the Egyptian delta, not toward the political heartland of Egypt, but rather toward the desert frontier shelled by Canaan, Edom, and Arabia. Here, a fascinating concept emerges for the history of religions. Ancient Israelite poetic traditions seem to remember Hashem as a deity who bursts forth from the desert south, as a god of storm and fire emerging from arid, mountainous regions. Some scholars even compare these images to ancient traditions of the Levant, in which deities are depicted marching forth from sacred mountains situated on the periphery. The desert was not an absence of God, it was precisely the stage for his manifestation. That said, this does not automatically prove that Sinai was located in what is now Saudi Arabia. It would be an exaggeration to assert that with historical certainty. But it does weaken the idea of an exclusively Egyptian and belatedly traditional setting. For the oldest poetic strata of the Bible seem to preserve a different memory, that of a god who comes from the southeast, from the desert mountains associated with Edom, Paran, and Teman. And perhaps therein lies one of the deepest secrets of Sinai. Biblical revelation is not born at the center of civilization, it is born at the edge of the known world. In the biblical mindset, the desert was not empty, it was the place where the heavens could still speak. Now, There is something deeply revealing in the way Rabbinic Judaism approaches Mount Sinai. The sages inherited the most sacred site in biblical memory, and yet they almost never obsessed over locating it on a map. For in rabbinic thought, the true issue was never geographical, it was spiritual. In the literature of the Talmud and the Midrash, Sinai ceases to be merely a mountain and transforms into a theological symbol of universal scope. The rabbis ask a question very different from that of modern archaeologists. They do not ask, where exactly is the mountain? They ask, why was the Torah given in the wilderness? And the answer is extraordinary. The wilderness belongs to everyone and to no one. It is not the property of any empire. It possesses no permanent political borders. The Torah had to be given in a place that was free, open, and situated outside the structures of human power. Then arises another classic question. Why on a small mountain? The Midrash teaches that God did not choose the highest or most majestic mountains to reveal the Torah, but rather a humble mountain. It is a lesson against spiritual pride. In other words, revelation does not descend upon those who arrogantly exalt themselves, but upon those who know how to make themselves small. Even the name Sinai receives symbolic interpretations. Some sages link the word to Sinah, hatred. According to one famous rabbinic reading, it was from Sinai that the nation's hatred toward Israel descended, stemming from Israel's divine election and the Torah. Others interpret the name as signifying a radical transformation of human consciousness in the face of idolatry. And then we encounter one of Rashi's most beautiful commentaries on Exodus 19:2. There, he explains that Israel encamped before the mountain as one man with one heart. Observe the difference. The biblical text describes encampments and journeys, but Rabbinic Judaism shifts the focus toward the inner state of the people. Spiritual unity matters more than topographical coordinates, and this is fundamental to understanding the classical Jewish tradition. Judaism preserved the absolute centrality of Sinai, yet it did not develop a cartographic obsession with identifying it with archaeological precision. For the rabbinic memory understands Sinai primarily as a foundational event, not as a tourist destination. The place matters, yes, but even more important is what occurred there. A fragmented people listening to a voice capable of transforming slaves into a spiritual nation. And perhaps that is why the map remained partially blurred. For the true Sinai, in the Jewish tradition, was not merely a mountain in the desert, but the instant in which human beings learn that freedom without purpose ultimately becomes another form of slavery. When we turn to Philo of Alexandria, we enter a fascinating world, that of 1st century Hellenistic Judaism. It is a universe where the Torah dialogues with Greek philosophy, where Jerusalem engages in intellectual conversation with Plato, and where Sinai begins to acquire an almost cosmic dimension. Philo is not a rabbi of the Talmud, nor is he a Roman historian. He is a Jew profoundly influenced by the philosophical thought of Alexandria, one of the most important intellectual centers of the ancient world. And precisely for this reason, his testimony is so valuable. In his work, De Vita Moses, The Life of Moses, Philo describes the mountain that Moses ascends as the highest and most sacred mountain in that region, a place that is difficult to access, remote and majestic. Now, observe carefully what Philo does and what he does not do. He provides no coordinates, he identifies no nearby city, he traces no exact routes. He does not say, Sinai is located exactly here. And that is extraordinarily important, for even in the 1st century, vast geographical traditions regarding the Exodus already existed. Yet, even a learned and sophisticated author like Philo offers a description that is reverential rather than cartographic. For him, Sinai is, above all, a sublime mountain, high, sacred, inaccessible, almost detached from the ordinary human world. And here, a profoundly philosophical element emerges. In ancient thought, mountains symbolized the proximity between heaven and earth. Ascending a mountain was not merely a physical journey, it was a spiritual and intellectual elevation. Philo consistently interprets the life of Moses allegorically. The ascent of the mountain also represents the ascent of the soul toward the divine. The leader must withdraw from the noise of the world in order to receive wisdom. Thus, in Philo's work, Sinai begins to become something more than a mere geographical feature. It transforms into a spiritual architecture. And this confirms something crucial to our investigation. Even within ancient Judaism, there did not yet exist a rigid and universally established topographical identification of the mountain. What did exist was a reverential memory, a collective consciousness that Sinai belonged to the category of liminal places, spaces where human beings draw perilously close to the transcendent. For in antiquity, the sacred was rarely comfortable or accessible. That which was truly holy was distant, high above, hidden, and demanded ascent. When we read Flavius Josephus, we enter a different level of ancient Jewish memory. We are no longer standing solely before the biblical text, but before a historian attempting to explain the tradition of Israel to the Greco-Roman world. And what is interesting is that Josephus confirms something we had already observed in Philo, yet he does so with even greater dramatic intensity. In Jewish Antiquities 3.76, Josephus describes Sinai as the highest of all the mountains in that region. He adds that it was extremely difficult to ascend due to its precipices, and that it was in fact inaccessible owing to the belief that God dwelt there. Note the intensity of this description. It is no ordinary desert hill. It is an extraordinary mountain, towering, formidable, rugged, set apart from ordinary human access. And here, a fascinating convergence emerges between Philo and Josephus. Both authors, though differing in style and purpose, preserve three fundamental characteristics regarding Sinai. First, exceptional height. Second, difficulty of access. Third, a sacred and terrifying nature. This implies that, for a significant segment of Second Temple Judaism, Sinai was remembered not merely as the site where the Torah was revealed, but as a towering mountain, one that was almost forbidden. However, the great geographical silence reappears. Josephus, too, fails to provide unequivocal coordinates. He does not identify the mountain with cartographic precision. He offers no verifiable location for a modern explorer, and herein lies a critical problem for contemporary researchers. When Josephus refers to the region, which region exactly does he mean? Is he speaking of the Sinai Peninsula as we understand it today? Is he referring to the narrative setting of the Exodus? Is he describing the vast desert belt stretching between Egypt, Edom, Midian, and Arabia? The text does not fully clarify this point, and that is decisive. For many modern reconstructions attempt to turn Josephus into an ancient GPS, when, in reality, his primary intention was theological and historical, not topographical. What Josephus does preserve is a very powerful cultural memory, the idea that Sinai belonged to the realm of the sacred mountains of the ancient world, elevated places where the divine presence inspired both fascination and awe. And perhaps therein we grasp something essential about the biblical experience. In the modern era, we seek coordinates, but the ancient world sought meaning. For them, the central question was not merely where is the mountain, but rather what kind of human being can survive having climbed it.
For millennia, the world has sought the sacred mountain, a place of fire, glory, and mystery. Where is Mount Sinai really located? Ancient traditions and new evidence challenge what we thought we knew. Archaeologists and explorers follow the traces of an enigma that has remained buried for centuries. This truth will be revealed to you today.
Now, there is a phrase in the New Testament that has sparked decades of historical, geographical, and theological debate, a single line that, for many researchers, reopened the mystery of Mount Sinai. Paul of Tarsus writes in Galatians 4:25, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and immediately the inevitable question arises, what exactly did he mean by Arabia? Here we must proceed with the utmost rigor, for this verse has been exploited, often to an exaggerated degree, by both apologists and sensationalist theorists alike. The Greek text does indeed explicitly link Sinai with Arabia. That is undeniable. However, there is a fundamental problem. In the first century, Arabia did not necessarily signify what we understand today as modern-day Saudi Arabia. That is a completely anachronistic error. Furthermore, and this is crucial, in this passage the Apostle Paul is drawing an analogy between the child of the promise, Sarah's son, and the one who did not partake in that promise, Hagar's son. According to some researchers, in this paragraph, Saul of Tarsus may even be citing a midrash from that era. Whether or not this is true, what is certain is that Paul is not speaking literally, but rather employing an analogy of expressions, a rabbinic technique well known in his time and subsequently in the Talmud. Thus, To the Roman and Hellenistic world, Arabia could refer to a vast cultural and political region inhabited or controlled by Arab and Nabatean peoples. It encompassed territories such as Arabia Petrea, areas of present-day southern Jordan, Transjordan, parts of the Negev, Edom, and even regions situated to the east and southeast of the Dead Sea. In other words, Arabia was a concept far broader and more fluid than a modern national border. For this reason, Galatians 4:25 does not automatically prove that Mount Sinai was located at Jabal al-Laus or within the borders of modern-day Saudi Arabia. Such a conclusion stretches far beyond what the text itself permits us to assert. Yet, neither can this piece of evidence be ignored, for it does indeed demonstrate something of extreme importance. For Paul, or for the Jewish and Hellenistic tradition he reflects, Sinai could be conceived as part of the Eastern or Southeastern Arab world, and that proves to be highly significant, especially because it partially aligns with those ancient biblical traditions that linked Sinai with Paran, Seir, Edom, and Teman. Here we grasp something essential about ancient geography. Borders were fluid. Regional identities shifted according to trade, tribes, empires, and caravan routes. That is why the correct interpretation is not Paul definitively resolved the location of Sinai. No, the correct interpretation is far more interesting. Paul reopens the debate. He compels us to ask what Arabia truly meant to a first-century Hellenistic Jew. And when we ask that question with historical honesty, we discovered that the map of ancient Sinai was far broader, more ambiguous, and more dynamic than we typically imagine. For perhaps the problem was never simply a matter of finding a mountain. The true challenge lies in learning to conceptualize the biblical world using ancient categories rather than modern maps superimposed upon sacred texts. When we turn to Eusebius of Caesarea and Jerome, we enter a decisive moment in biblical history, the instant in which Christianity begins to transform sacred memory into organized geography. Until then, Sinai was, above all, a textual, theological, and liturgical tradition, but between the 4th and 5th centuries, a new impulse emerged to physically identify biblical sites. And here, the Christian geography of late antiquity was born. Eusebius, in his famous Onomasticon, attempted to catalog biblical sites and correlate them with territories known in his own time. Jerome, subsequently, expanded and translated much of this work. Both connected Horeb and Sinai with desert regions associated with Paran and with territories linked to Arab or Saracen peoples. This is in itself significant, for even at this stage, the memory of Sinai still retained broad Oriental and desert resonances, not merely a narrow, precise identification. However, at the very same time, another monumental historical phenomenon was unfolding: the rise of Christian monasticism. Monks began to seek out the desert as a space for encountering God, and Sinai became the perfect symbol of that spirituality. Gradually, tradition began to coalesce around the southern Sinai Peninsula, specifically around Jebel Musa and the region that would later come to be associated with St. Catherine's Monastery. And here, a fundamental historical tension emerges. The traditional Egyptian location does indeed possess immense antiquity and veneration. It is not a modern invention. Rather, it is deeply rooted in centuries of pilgrimage, liturgy, and Christian memory. Yet, neither can it be honestly asserted that this identification is directly Mosaic or explicitly biblical. It is rather a consolidation of late antiquity, Christian, monastic, and also imperial. For in the wake of Constantine, the Christian Roman Empire developed a profound interest in physically locating the settings of biblical events. Holy sites began to be institutionalized. Churches, pilgrimage routes, and monastic centers were constructed. The spiritual map began to take shape upon the land, and thus Sinai ceased to be merely a theological symbol, becoming instead a concrete sacred destination. But observe carefully what this implies. The tradition of the Southern Peninsula holds historical authority as a continuous religious memory, though not necessarily as definitive archaeological proof. That completely changes the conversation, for the true debate is not between true and false. It lies between distinct layers of memory: the biblical, the Jewish, the Christian, the monastic, and the imperial. And perhaps that explains why Sinai remains so difficult to pinpoint with absolute certainty. for some mountains belong as much to history as they do to the power of the tradition that remembers them. One of the greatest errors in the debate surrounding Mount Sinai lies in reading ancient texts with modern maps in mind, and here a pivotal name emerges: Claudius Ptolemy. Ptolemy, the great Greco-Roman geographer of the 2nd century, divided the Arab world into several regions: Arabia Petrea, Arabia Deserta, and Arabia Felix. And therein lies the problem, for when a modern reader hears the word Arabia, they immediately envision the modern-day kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Yet for the ancient world, that term was far more fluid. Arabia Petrea, for instance, was not confined to the modern Arabian Peninsula. It encompassed territories associated with Nabatea, Edom, parts of Transjordan, and even regions linked to the Sinai itself. In other words, ancient borders did not function like those of our contemporary nation-states. They were cultural zones, spheres of influence, trade corridors, shifting tribal and administrative territories. And this completely transforms the discussion regarding the Sinai. For when Paul speaks of Arabia, or when other ancient sources link the Sinai to Arabia, they are not necessarily thinking of modern-day Saudi Arabia, nor, however, are they employing Arabia merely as a spiritual metaphor. The term possessed genuine geographical substance. It was simply a substance far broader and more elastic in nature. Arabia could refer to the Nabatean kingdom, to Edom, to Transjordanian territories, to desert regions situated south and east of Judea, to parts of the Negev, and even to areas associated with the Sinai itself under the Greco-Roman classification system. And here we understand why so many modern debates end up distorted. Many attempt to shoehorn ancient texts into borders established nearly 2,000 years later. It is akin to attempting to interpret a Roman map using contemporary political divisions. The inevitable result is anachronism. For this reason, from a historical standpoint, the phrase Sinai in Arabia must be interpreted with the utmost precision. It does not automatically prove a location within modern-day Saudi Arabia. Yet, neither does it allow us to rule out the eastern or southeastern connection of Sinai with the Arab and Nabatean world. What it actually does is compel us to abandon simplistic categories. And here emerges a fundamental methodological lesson for any serious inquiry into the Bible. Ancient texts do not inhabit our maps. They inhabit their own mental, political, and geographical worlds. And perhaps the researcher's true challenge is not merely to locate Sinai, but to learn to think as those did who first uttered that name in the midst of the desert. When we turn to the Islamic tradition, we discover something extraordinary. Sinai does not vanish with Judaism or Christianity. It remains alive in the spiritual memory of the Semitic world. The Quran mentions the mountain associated with Musa, Moses, several times, using expressions such as Tur Sina and Tur Sinin. The Arabic word Tur means mountain, specifically a lofty or sacred mountain. And here, a fascinating detail emerges. The Quran does not present the mountain merely as a geographical feature, but rather as the setting for divine revelation, exactly as it appears in the biblical tradition. Moses ascends the mountain. He receives the divine word. He hears the voice of God. And the desert once again becomes a space for spiritual transformation. Later Islamic tradition, particularly following the expansion of classical Islam, generally tended to identify this mountain with the Sinai traditionally recognized within the Egyptian peninsula. Over time, numerous pilgrimage routes, Quranic commentaries, and local chronicles served to consolidate this association. However, we must make a very important distinction here. Early Islamic tradition does not function as an archaeological GPS, nor was its primary interest cartographic in the modern sense. What it preserves is something perhaps even more profound, the continuity of the Sinaitic memory within the Semitic universe. The Mountain of Moses continues to exist as a symbol of the encounter between humanity and divine revelation. And observe something of great significance. Early Islamic geography retains a remarkably broad scope. Egypt, the desert, Midian, and the borderlands leading toward Arabia appear consistently interconnected within the narrative of Musa. In other words, Islam inherits a sacred landscape of great antiquity, one in which Sinai belongs to that desert corridor stretching between Africa and Arabia, between Egypt and the eastern trade routes. And this holds immense historical value, for it demonstrates that the memory of the mountain was not confined within the boundaries of a single religious tradition. Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, each in their own way, preserve the concept of a mountain of revelation associated with Moses and the desert. Now, from a critical perspective, the Islamic tradition too fails to definitively resolve the exact location of the biblical Sinai. Yet it does confirm something fundamental. The ancient Semitic consciousness never understood Sinai as merely just another mountain. It was a point of contact between heaven and earth, a liminal space, a place where the divine voice interrupted the normal course of human history. And perhaps that explains why Sinai remains so powerful after millennia. For beyond maps and coordinates, the mountain represents the idea that human beings can enter the desert and emerge transformed by a word that transcends them. Here we arrive at the methodological heart of the entire debate surrounding Mount Sinai, and it is a problem far deeper than it appears. The Bible describes an absolutely extraordinary event at Sinai: fire, cloud, thunder, a divine voice, a covenant, a revelation, and the spiritual birth of Israel as a people. But archaeology operates with a different kind of language. Archaeology does not excavate miracles, it excavates material remains: pottery, bones, structures, inscriptions, encampments, petroglyphs, metallurgical remains, altars, ancient roots, and therein lies the great tension between text and historical science. For even if we were to find evidence of human occupation on a specific mountain in the desert, that would not automatically prove that the revelation at Sinai took place there. Archaeology can formulate very precise and legitimate questions. Was there a human presence in this region during the Bronze or Iron Age? Do remains exist that are consistent with semi-nomadic groups? Was the route from Egypt to Kadesh Barnea viable? Was the area under Egyptian, Midianite, Edomite, Nabatean, or Arab influence? Are there ancient cultic sites? All these questions are historically valid, but none of them can prove a theophany, and it is fundamental to understand this. For the biblical Sinai is not merely a place, it is a theological event. Archaeology can study the setting, but it cannot measure the divine presence with scientific instruments. Now, here two dangerous extremes emerge, extremes that every serious researcher must avoid. The first is automatic skepticism, that stance which dismisses any historical possibility before even examining the sources, as if every ancient tradition were necessarily fiction. But the opposite extreme is equally problematic, the desperate apologetics that transforms any blackened stone in the desert into evidence of the fire of God. That is not research, it is religious anxiety disguised as archaeology. And curiously, both extremes end up sharing the same flaw: they abandon rigor. Serious inquiry demands something more difficult: intellectual humility, to accept that ancient texts may preserve genuine historical memories without turning every detail into absolute proof, and to accept too that archaeology has legitimate methodological limits. For there are human experiences that transform entire civilizations, even if they leave behind no traces that are easy to excavate. After all, no one can unearth freedom, moral conscience, or revelation with a shovel. And perhaps therein lies the paradox of Sinai. The most influential event in biblical history took place in a desert, precisely the kind of place where material traces vanish most quickly, yet where spiritual traces endure for millennia. When most people think of Mount Sinai, they immediately picture a specific place: Jebel Musa, in the southern Sinai Peninsula, adjacent to the famous Monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt. And this is no coincidence. For centuries, this has been the most influential traditional identification of the biblical Sinai. The area possesses immense spiritual power. There, the memories of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam converge. The Monastery of St. Catherine, founded under Emperor Justinian between the 6th and 7th centuries, is one of the oldest Christian monasteries in the world that remains in continuous operation to this day, and the landscape is deeply awe-inspiring. Rugged mountains, absolute silence, desert, altitude, isolation. It is easy to understand why entire generations viewed this as the perfect setting for divine revelation. Late antique Christian tradition transformed this site into a center of pilgrimage, prayer, and monastic life. And over time, Jebel Musa became so deeply embedded in the global religious consciousness that for many believers, the matter seemed settled. But this is where critical inquiry enters the picture. For a venerable tradition does not automatically equate to historical proof. And therein lies the great archaeological challenge. The existence of the monastery demonstrates that Byzantine Christianity sanctified this landscape, but it does not, in and of itself, prove that this was necessarily the Sinai of the Exodus. The tradition is ancient, but not Mosaic. It took shape many centuries after the biblical events. That said, it would be unfair to dismiss Jebel Musa out of hand. It possesses very significant strengths. It boasts an extraordinary religious continuity. It is supported by a robust and enduring Christian tradition. Visually, it fits the image of a sacred, inaccessible mountain. Furthermore, it lay along ancient pilgrimage routes that preserved its memory for centuries. Nevertheless, serious difficulties also exist. There is no direct archaeological evidence of a massive Israelite encampment in the area. There is no ancient inscription unequivocally identifying the mountain as Sinai or Horeb. Furthermore, some researchers consider the detail found in Deuteronomy 1:2, which speaks of an 11-day journey between Horeb and Kadesh Barnea, to be problematic. According to certain reconstructions, Jebel Musa may lie too far away to fit comfortably with that reference. Consider, then, the actual situation. Jebel Musa is not a modern fraud, nor is it a fantasy invented yesterday. It is a powerful, profound, and venerable historical tradition. Yet, from a strictly archaeological standpoint, it remains unproven in any definitive way. And perhaps that explains why Sinai continues to hold such fascination, for it represents the point where memory, faith, geography, empire, pilgrimage, and historical inquiry all intersect. A mountain that millions revere, even though no one can yet point to it with absolute certainty and declare, "This is where it all happened." We now arrive at the most controversial, high-profile, and arguably most explosive candidate in the entire modern debate regarding Mount Sinai, Jabal al-Lawz, and specifically the area surrounding Jabal Makla, located in the Tabuk region of northwestern Saudi Arabia. Over the last few decades, this hypothesis has gained enormous popularity in documentaries, evangelical circles, and biblical tourism. And one must admit, from a narrative standpoint, it is incredibly powerful, for it appears to connect many pieces of the puzzle simultaneously. Proponents of this theory argue that Midian was situated in the Arabian northwest. Moses, they note, fled to Midian precisely. They then point out that Paul asserts in Galatians 4:25 that Sinai is in Arabia. Furthermore, they add that the region features imposing mountains, desert landscapes consistent with the biblical account, and structures or petroglyphs that some interpret as potential cultic remains linked to the Exodus. And here, a distinctly modern psychological element comes into play. The Saudi hypothesis possesses immense visual power: black mountains, remote deserts, dramatic landscapes, blackened rocks, which some present as traces of divine fire. All of this works extraordinarily well in film, television, and social media. But precisely for that reason, we must exercise extreme rigor, for a compelling narrative does not automatically equate to solid historical evidence. And this is where specialized academic criticism steps in. To date, Jabal al-Lawz lacks any serious archaeological consensus identifying it as the definitive location of the biblical Sinai. Many of the alleged discoveries are, in fact, open to visual interpretation. The petroglyphs do not prove an Israelite presence. The structures uncovered could belong to any number of desert cultures. The blackened rock does not demonstrate supernatural fire. And a significant portion of the reconstruction hinges upon highly contested theories regarding the crossing of the Red Sea, or the Yam Suf. Furthermore, some researchers point out another significant problem. The distance between Jabal al-Lawz and Kadesh Barnea could create a tension with Deuteronomy 1:2 if the reference to the 11-day journey is taken literally. And here, another very common methodological pitfall emerges, confusing ancient Arabia with modern-day Saudi Arabia. They are not equivalent. The Arabia of the biblical and Greco-Roman worlds was a region far broader, more fluid, and culturally diverse. So, what responsible conclusion can be drawn? Jabal al-Lawz possesses enormous narrative, geopolitical, and visual appeal. It aligns remarkably well with certain traditions regarding Midian and with the concept of an Eastern Sinai. Yet, from an archaeological standpoint, the evidence remains insufficient, and perhaps this reveals something fascinating about our own era. We live in a world obsessed with unearthing definitive proof, spectacular imagery, and absolute certainties. But Sinai continues to elude us, as if the Bible's most famous mountain still insisted on remaining partially veiled behind the desert, compelling us to distinguish between evidence, interpretation, and desire.
For millennia, the world has sought the sacred mountain, a place of fire, glory, and mystery. Where is Mount Sinai really located? Ancient traditions and new evidence challenge what we thought we knew. Archaeologists and explorers follow the traces of an enigma that has remained buried for centuries. This truth will be revealed to you today.
Among all the modern proposals regarding Mount Sinai, there is one that tends to receive far less media attention than Jabal al-Laws, yet commands much greater respect within certain archaeological circles, Har Karkom, located in the Negev Desert. And here, the narrative takes on a completely different tone, for Har Karkom does not stem primarily from sensationalist documentaries or religious tourism. Rather, it emerges from decades of genuine archaeological research. The driving force behind this hypothesis was Emanuele Anati, an archaeologist who conducted extensive surveys in the region and was struck by the site's immense concentration of cultural remains and rock art. Petroglyphs, altars, sanctuaries, ritual vestiges, sacred mountains. All of these elements are distributed across the landscape of Har Karkom in a truly extraordinary manner. And here a powerful idea takes shape. Anati proposed that Har Karkom may have served as a major desert ceremonial center in antiquity, possibly one significant enough to preserve echoes of the biblical Sinaitic tradition. Unlike other, more sensationalist theories, this proposal possesses a significant methodological strength. It is grounded in excavations, topography, and field archaeology. Moreover, Har Karkom boasts another distinct advantage. Its location aligns more closely with the biblical axis of the Negev, Paran, Kadesh Barnea region than do the sites proposed by certain more distant theories. This becomes particularly intriguing when one recalls the ancient poetic traditions linking Sinai with Paran, Seir, and the southern desert regions. But then, the major stumbling block appears: the chronology. Many of the significant archaeological remains at Har Karkom date to periods predating the traditional time frame assigned to the Exodus, particularly if one posits a date associated with the Late Bronze Age or the 13th century BCE. In other words, the site does indeed appear to have been a sacred place, but perhaps too early in time. And this enormously complicates its identification, for an ancient ritual mountain does not automatically equate to the biblical Mount Sinai. Here, research must proceed with the utmost caution. It is tempting to encounter a sacred landscape and immediately declare, here the revelation took place, but archaeology demands greater prudence. It is not enough to demonstrate that a site held religious significance. One must also demonstrate concrete historical connections to Israel, to the Exodus narrative, and to textual traditions. And thus far, this has not been possible in a conclusive manner. That is why the critical assessment regarding Har Karkom is so intriguing. It is likely an archaeologically more rigorous hypothesis than many of the popular theories circulating on the internet, yet neither does it definitively resolve the mystery of Sinai, and perhaps this compels us to accept something uncomfortable, yet intellectually honest. There may have been more than one sacred mountain within the collective imagination of the ancient desert, and the biblical Sinai may well have emerged in a world where landscape, memory, and revelation were intertwined long before anyone could fix them upon a definitive map. There exists a line of inquiry far less famous than the Saudi theories or the tradition of Saint Catherine, yet one that is extremely interesting from a geographical standpoint. The idea that the true Sinai might be located much farther north than we typically imagine. And here, a name largely unknown to the general public emerges: Jebel Musa. Some researchers argue that the historical error lay in shifting the Exodus narrative too far toward the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. According to this perspective, the mountain should be sought in the northern or north-central Sinai, closer to the natural routes leading toward Canaan and specifically toward Kadesh Barnea. And what is the central argument? Deuteronomy 1:2, that famous verse stating that there is a journey of 11 days from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. For many specialists, this detail is simply too significant to ignore. For if one takes this reference to an 11-day journey seriously, then both Jebel Musa and Jabal al-Laws might prove to be too far away, and that compels us to completely reconsider the traditional map. Here, the North Sinai hypothesis gains momentum. A more northerly location would align better with certain reconstructions of the route from Egypt to southern Canaan. It would also obviate the need to extend the entire Israelite journey all the way to the southern extremity of the Gulf of Aqaba. Furthermore, this theory introduces a methodologically intriguing point. In Greco-Roman times, the designation Arabia did not necessarily exclude regions of the eastern or northeastern Sinai. In other words, certain ancient references could remain compatible with a location situated closer to the Negev. And yet another problem arises. These proposals often lack symbolic weight. They do not possess the visual majesty of Jebel Musa. They lack the remote, dramatic aura of Jabal al-Laus. They are not backed by centuries of monastic pilgrimage, nor do they benefit from a strong religious tradition that has preserved the site as sacred ground, and that influences our perception far more than we are usually willing to admit. For collective memory does not survive solely through geography. It survives through liturgy, narratives, pilgrimages, and cultural continuity. Moreover, the archaeological evidence in these regions remains insufficient to establish a definitive identification. So, what does this hypothesis truly leave us with? Something very important. It reminds us that the question of Sinai does not depend solely on spirituality or tradition. It also depends on logistics, distances, ancient routes, and geographical feasibility. In other words, the debate compels us to combine the Bible, archaeology, topography, and the anthropology of the desert. And perhaps that explains why Sinai continues to elude any absolute conclusion. For the more one studies the map, the more evident it becomes that the true challenge is not finding an impressive mountain. It is finding a mountain that succeeds in harmonizing text, history, memory, and geography, all at once. Here we arrive at the most uncomfortable point in the entire investigation regarding Mount Sinai, the fact that both apologists and skeptics will prefer to avoid. To this day, no massive, unequivocal, and universally accepted Israelite encampment has been found at any of the proposed locations for Sinai, not at Jebel Musa, not at Jabal al-Laus, not at Har Karkom, nor in the northern Sinai. And this archaeological silence carries enormous weight. However, at this juncture, we must exercise great historical precision. The absence of evidence does not automatically equate to evidence of absence. That would be a dangerous oversimplification. Nomadic or semi-nomadic groups typically leave behind extremely fragile traces, especially in desert regions. The wind erodes, the sand covers, roots shift, organic materials vanish. Moreover, a people in transit does not necessarily construct monumental cities capable of surviving for 3,000 years. The desert preserves some things in extraordinary fashion, while erasing others almost completely. For this reason, many archaeologists remind us that even major ancient human migrations can leave behind only minimal traces. Yet, neither can we fall into the opposite extreme. For here arises another serious methodological problem. It is not enough to find piles of stones and declare, Israel was here. Ambiguous petroglyphs are not sufficient, nor are traces of fire, nor ancient corrals, nor altars lacking clear dating, nor isolated pottery shards, nor local traditions that emerge centuries later. All of these may be interesting, but they do not constitute definitive proof of the biblical Sinai. And here we must understand how serious archaeology actually functions. To identify a site with any degree of confidence, a much more robust convergence of evidence is required. An appropriate chronology, a coherent cultural context, viable routes, material remains compatible with specific populations, potential epigraphic references, and furthermore, a reasonable harmony with ancient textual sources. It is this type of convergence that allows hypotheses to be transformed into strong scholarly proposals. And to this moment, that convergence simply does not exist for Sinai. That does not automatically destroy the biblical narrative, but it does call for intellectual prudence. For the true investigator must learn to live with uncertainty without falling into either dogmatism or automatic denial. And perhaps therein lies an extraordinary irony. The most influential spiritual event in the Bible occurred precisely in the kind of environment where material history becomes most difficult to trace, as if the desert had preserved the religious memory while slowly erasing the physical traces. And perhaps that tension is an inseparable part of Sinai itself, a mountain capable of transforming entire civilizations, without ever allowing itself to be fully captured by archaeology. There lies a deeply human problem behind the entire quest for Mount Sinai, and it is not merely archaeological, it is psychological. Many researchers, documentary filmmakers, and pilgrims are not truly searching for a mountain, they are searching for confirmation. Confirmation that the reading of the Bible is correct, confirmation that the religious tradition is right, confirmation that is visible, tangible, and photographable. And therein lies one of the greatest methodological dangers in modern biblical archaeology: confirmation bias. In the academic world, this phenomenon occurs when a person starts with the conclusion first and then rearranges all the evidence to support it. In other words, they do not honestly ask, what do the data show, but rather, how can I make the data fit what I already believe? And when that happens, the entire desert can transform into a vast mirror of religious desires. That is when highly problematic interpretations begin to emerge. A blackened rock immediately becomes proof of divine fire. A boba in petroglyph is taken to be the golden calf. A stone structure is identified as a mosaic altar. A cave transforms into the cave of Elijah. A plain is declared the encampment of Israel. Now, we must be intellectually honest. None of these hypotheses is impossible in itself. The problem is not possibility, the problem is method. For without clear dating, solid archaeological context, and converging evidence, these interpretations remain firmly in the realm of speculation. And here lies a crucial distinction between serious archaeology and emotional archaeology. Scientific archaeology operates on probabilities, stratigraphy, chronology, and comparative context. Emotional archaeology operates on narrative enthusiasm. And curiously, the more sacred a site is to millions of people, the greater the temptation tends to be to overinterpret any given discovery. For human beings desperately desire to physically touch that which they deem holy. They want a stone, a mountain, visible proof, something they can point to and say, it happened here. But ancient history rarely works so neatly, and perhaps Sinai is the best example of this. A mountain whose spiritual power is immense, precisely because it never quite became an absolute archaeological certainty. This compels the honest researcher to walk a very difficult line, neither naive credulity nor automatic cynicism, but rather intellectual discipline, the capacity to acknowledge when something is possible without immediately turning it into proven fact. And perhaps that is one of the most important lessons of the entire debate. Faith can inspire legitimate questions, but when the need to prove supplants the search for truth, even the desert begins to yield mirages. There is a detail that completely transforms the debate surrounding Mount Sinai. The discussion is not merely archaeological or biblical, it is also geopolitical. For Sinai is not just a mountain, it is a symbol charged with tourism, identity, religion, national memory, and cultural power. Let us begin with Egypt. For the Egyptian state, Jebel Musa and St. Catherine's Monastery constitute a vast strategic heritage. It is not solely a matter of spirituality, it is also a matter of cultural sovereignty, international tourism, and historical prestige. The St. Catherine region has been recognized as a World Heritage Site and holds immense symbolic weight for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. In recent years, Egypt has spearheaded tourism development projects in the area, seeking to transform it into a major global religious destination. However, a delicate tension arises here. The development of hotels, infrastructure, and new projects has drawn criticism from those who fear that the sacred landscape will lose its authenticity. Local Bedouins, conservationists, and heritage experts have warned of the cultural and environmental impact of this expansion. And so, an uncomfortable question emerges. What would happen if the world began to seriously entertain a Saudi hypothesis regarding Sinai? For Egypt, this would not be merely an academic debate. It would represent a potential loss of symbolic, touristic, and religious capital. Next comes Israel, and here the subject acquires another layer of historical depth. Sinai remained under Israeli control following the Six-Day War of 1967 and was subsequently returned to Egypt pursuant to the peace agreements. This means that Sinai is not merely a biblical subject. It is also a matter of military memory, borders, and contemporary diplomacy. Furthermore, biblical archaeology in Israel has always been intertwined with questions of national identity and the historical continuity between text, land, and people. Israel does not require Mount Sinai to lie within its modern borders, yet the narrative of the Exodus and the giving of the Torah lies at the very heart of its civilizational memory. For this reason, the subject is never entirely neutral. And finally, we arrive at Saudi Arabia. For decades, northwestern Saudi Arabia remained relatively close to international tourism. But with Vision 2030, the kingdom embarked on a monumental transformation. Alula, Tabuk, Hegra, Neom, Taima, this entire desert corridor became the centerpiece of a new cultural and economic strategy. And this is where Jabal al-Laus comes in. Saudi Arabia need not officially declare that the biblical Sinai was located there. It suffices to open up the region, develop infrastructure, and allow documentaries, tour operators, and pilgrimages to fuel the narrative. And that completely changes the game, for suddenly the Sinai ceases to be merely a matter of ancient archaeology. It becomes a symbolic contest, one involving religious memories, tourism economies, and contemporary national projects. And perhaps this reveals something fascinating about the power of the Bible. 3,000 years later, a mountain whose location remains uncertain continues to shape modern borders, identities, and geopolitical strategies, as if the echo of the Sinai were still reverberating, not only in faith, but also in power. There is a modern phenomenon completely transforming the debate surrounding Mount Sinai. Archaeology has ceased to be merely academic research. It is now also a narrative industry, and at the very center of it all stands religious tourism. For millions of people do not simply want to study Sinai, they want to climb it, to photograph it, to feel it, to post about it, to experience the illusion of physically touching biblical revelation. And there, a new silent battle begins. Egypt holds the advantage of a firmly established historical tradition. St. Catherine's offers a profoundly powerful experience. The ancient monastery, the purported burning bush, the nocturnal pilgrimage to Jebel Musa, and the sunrise over the Sinai mountains. It is a narrative of continuity. The pilgrim feels as though they are entering a place sanctified by centuries of uninterrupted prayer. But Saudi Arabia is constructing a completely different narrative. It does not sell monastic antiquity. It sells mystery. It sells discovery. It sells the hidden Sinai. With the kingdom's opening to tourism and the launch of colossal projects in Tabuk and Saudi Arabia's northwest, private tours have begun to emerge, associated with the land of Midian and sites popularly linked to Moses. And here, something fascinating emerges from a cultural standpoint. Egypt sells established memory. Saudi Arabia sells archaeological adventure. Egypt offers tradition. Saudi Arabia offers rediscovered revelation. Meanwhile, Israel occupies yet another narrative space, the broader historical, biblical, and archaeological context of the Exodus, connected to the Negev, Kadesh Barnea, and the textual memory of Israel. Then come the religious production companies, documentaries, YouTube channels, biblical series, evangelical tourism, all competing to present the mountain finally found. Observe what is taking place. Archaeology is beginning to transform into an audiovisual product. The desert is becoming a cinematic stage. Research is blending with spiritual marketing, and the more uncertain the evidence, the more powerful the commercial narrative can become. Because mystery sells. The idea of a hidden Sinai generates excitement, pilgrimage, and global religious consumption. And here, an uncomfortable question arises. Where does historical inquiry end, and where does the spiritual experience industry begin? For in the digital age, an archaeological hypothesis no longer requires academic consensus to capture the collective imagination. All it takes is a good story, striking visuals, and an audience eager to affirm its faith. And perhaps that reveals something profoundly human. Modern man still needs sacred mountains, even if he now visits them with drones, 4K cameras, and premium tour packages. For even in a technological civilization, we continue to seek the very same thing as the ancient pilgrims of the desert, a place where the heavens seem to speak closer to the earth. When we speak of Mount Sinai, many people envision nothing but desert, the Bible, and archaeology. Yet there is a dimension that often remains hidden from the documentary cameras: regional security. For Sinai is not merely a sacred landscape, it is one of the most sensitive strategic corridors in the Middle East. especially the northern part of the peninsula. For years, this region has experienced armed insurgency, intensive militarization, security checkpoints, and clashes between the Egyptian state and extremist groups. And this has direct consequences for both archaeology and tourism. It is not as simple as just going to dig. Access to certain zones may be restricted, research projects require complex permits, academic mobility becomes limited, and many areas remain geopolitically sensitive. That said, southern Sinai, home to St. Catherine's Monastery and Jebel Musa, has been far more stable from a tourism perspective. Yet, even there, the territory retains immense strategic importance for Egypt. And here, we must grasp a fundamental point. Egypt does not protect Sinai solely as a site of religious heritage. It protects it as a national frontier, an economic corridor, and a sovereign territory. Sinai connects Africa and Asia. It controls routes adjacent to the Suez Canal. It borders the Red Sea, and it is surrounded by extremely sensitive geopolitical actors: Israel, Gaza, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. All are part of a deeply interconnected regional system. Consequently, any discussion regarding Mount Sinai inevitably carries a political dimension. And here, a fascinating symbolic aspect comes into play. Relocating Mount Sinai from Egypt to Saudi Arabia means more than simply shifting a coordinate on a biblical map. It means altering the spiritual epicenter of the Exodus narrative. For Sinai is no ordinary mountain. It is the site of the covenant, of divine revelation, and of the spiritual birth of Israel. Thus, when competing national narratives begin to indirectly vie for this symbolic space, what is at stake is not merely archaeology. It is civilizational memory, and religious prestige, cultural influence, international tourism, and historical legitimacy. Observe the paradox. A mountain whose location remains unproven conclusively continues to affect modern diplomatic relations, tourism strategies, and national sensibilities, as if the biblical wilderness still cast a shadow over contemporary politics. And perhaps that explains something very profound about the nature of sacred places. They never belong solely to the past. The places where civilizations believe they have heard the voice of God inevitably become territories of identity, power, and human contention. There is a dimension of the debate surrounding Mount Sinai that is almost always overlooked: the communities that inhabit the desert. In St. Catherine, the Jebeliya Bedouins have coexisted for centuries with the monastery, the pilgrimage routes, and the sacred mountains. Yet, new Egyptian tourism projects have sparked fears regarding displacement, loss of identity, and the transformation of the spiritual landscape. A similar situation is unfolding in Saudi Arabia. Regions such as Tabuk, Alula, and Neom are being reshaped through massive tourism and archaeological projects. And there, an uncomfortable question arises. Who has the right to narrate the desert? The archaeologist, the state, the Bedouin, the rabbi, the monk, the documentary filmmaker? For Sinai is no longer merely biblical history. It is also heritage, tourism, and cultural power. And here, another key conflict emerges: the divide between academic archaeology and media-driven archaeology. Academia states, there is no definitive proof. Television announces, the true Sinai has been found. Tourism promises, walk where Moses walked. And social media transforms hypotheses into viral certainties. The reality is far more complex. Jebel Musa possesses immense historical and spiritual resonance, yet lacks definitive archaeological evidence. Jabal al-Laws is narratively fascinating, though academically tenuous. Har Karkom holds genuine archaeological interest, yet presents chronological challenges. And northern Sinai aligns better with certain geographical models, though it lacks a strong historical tradition. The sober conclusion is simple: no single site has been conclusively proven to be the biblical Sinai. And perhaps that is part of the mystery, for some mountains endure precisely because of the tension between memory, faith, and the human quest. That brings us to the end of today's class. Thank you very much for your attention. As always, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, give us a like, and visit us at our website, lamishna.com. This has been Abel Flores, founder of La Mishnah TV. Here are a couple of videos for you to continue studying with us. Shalom.